Hey everyone, my name is Jacob, and I am going to talk to you about phytoremediation and the project that I am currently working on with Dr. Engel. Phytoremediation, of course, is the combination of phyto, plant, and remediation to remedy. You are remedying something, usually a contaminant, with plants. And Dr. Engel and I are currently working on a project like that, but to talk about my project, I need to talk to you about phytoremediation. Haha, I'm up here now. Anyway, there's tons of different types of phytoremediation. I deal in phytoextraction, which is the first one on this slide, where you're pulling stuff up, typically heavy metals, from the soil and depositing them into the shoots or the leaves or some other area of the biomass. There's phytostabilization, where you are either stabilizing it in the soil, usually with roots, but you can also stabilize it in the plant somewhere sometimes, but that typically gets into other types of phytoremediation. There's phytodegradation or phytotransformation, where you're typically taking an organic compound and breaking it down into more simpler forms. There's phytovolatilization, which you're doing kind of the same thing, but you're bringing it up into the leaves where the more volatile aspects of the chemical can be released into the air, thereby leaving the more heavy metal side of that contaminant in the plant itself. There's also rhizofiltration, which is basically cleaning water. And you can also take salt out of the soil or water with phytodesalinization. Here's an image doing a really good job of explaining what I just tried to explain. Up here is phytovolatilization, which shows the more volatile aspects just kind of floating off into the air. Phytodegradation shows a more complex shape being broken down into more simple ones. Phytoextraction is, again, what I deal with, where it's just holding that metal in the plant. And phytostabilization kind of does the same thing, but around the roots. Phytodegradation can also happen at the roots, mainly because of the bacteria and fungi interactions, and that also helps with rhizofiltration. That typically cannot happen without some interaction with soil bacteria or fungi. Ha! I'm a sun now. Well, kind of, I guess, according to this diagram. This diagram also shows off phytostabilization, both in the roots and in the plant itself. I also kind of made this in more simple terms about how these things work and give you some examples. Uptake and accumulation, of course, kind of gets into that phytoextraction thing. You're actually pulling the plant, you're absorbing it either through the roots or sometimes from the air, but usually 9 times out of 10, I'd say it's through the roots. And they typically will store these in the shoots and the leaves, but they can also be stored in the roots in some plants. And typically these are heavy metals like arsenic, lead, in my case nickel, can even be iron depending on the soil. Transformation can be done with phytodegradation, where the plants will take really complex organic contaminants and break them down into less harmful, easier to deal with substances. Typically that's done using enzymes, and that breakdown is usually either a pesticide or a hydrocarbon, but it's not always the case. It can usually be anything that's an organic-based thing. But the rhizospheric interactions do the exact same thing. They can either stabilize the system and make it less bioavailable to other things. They can, and that's again typically done with not only the roots but with bacteria and fungi. But they can also deal with other biological things, again, hydrocarbons, but it can also be petroleum based. And those are typically, again, broken down with the help of those other life forms in the soil. All right. These two things are called, again, water filtration or rhizofiltration, and that is where plants will take heavy metals, radionuclides, wastewater, fecal matter, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and they will either stabilize it in the soil and keep it there, or they will filter it out and bring it into the plant. Kind of the same thing with phytodesalinization. It's basically phytoextraction, but it's just pulling salt out of the soil and making the soil more habitable and more healthy. And the salt can either accumulate on the plant and be scraped off, and the salt can be removed, or you have to remove the plant and take it out entirely and make it kind of an ex situ situation. All right, I could spend a lot of time on these slides, but I'm going to try to keep this particular ones on the quicker side because basically the plants are cheaper to use, but they do take longer. The roots are great at stabilizing soil, but if they don't go too deep, it sometimes doesn't solve the problem. and then it is usually really good at heavy metals and more organic things. But sometimes, depending on the climate and depending on the plant, depending on the soil, this just cannot work. It really does depend on the soil and the plant and how they can deal with the contaminant. This is a great segue to get into my research because the soils that this plant grows in are just this awful toxic plant. I deal with a plant called Streptanthus polygaloides, also known as milkwort jewel flower. And even though milkwort doesn't sound too good, jewel flower makes it sound like this is going to be a beautiful flower. It'll be a plant that you want to pick and put on your windowsill, but it's kind of just a weed. Here it is right here. That's one of the varieties. We actually don't know this variety at all. It's a completely unknown variety. Most of the other jewel flowers are bushier on the bottom, like the leaves are broader. These are very wiry. But it looks like this one actually accumulates quite a bit of nickel, and so we're hoping to find more about this. Um, like I said, this plant can accumulate massive amounts of nickel. It turns out that it does this not only because the soil is toxic, but it uses it to deal with herbivores, mainly insects that are trying to eat it. Because, like I said, it grows in a very toxic environment, so it doesn't thrive in this environment. It tends to just survive, which is still impressive. Um, because these soils are incredibly low in their nitrogen and phosphorus content, but they're incredibly high in high metals like chromium, nickel, cadmium sometimes, um, cobalt, and these typically will kill a plant off, but these things survive there. And it says adapted to thrive, but I put it in there because they do survive, and you'll see in the picture that they do conform. They conform blankets, but when you compare it to being in these pots, in the pots they can grow upwards of 3.5 feet tall, because they're given ideal watering conditions, fertilizer, all kinds of stuff. But in the wild, they typically get between 3 and 8 inches tall. All right, this is where things get interesting. First off, that plant right there is one of my experimental plants, and it's a purple variety, which typically the purple varieties have more nickel in them. Um, but this one was part of a test on different fertilizers we were using. And this one in particular, I believe, was a sulfur treatment. We were trying to make the soil more acidic. So, because typically that aids in nickel and heavy metal uptake. So we'll see if that works. We haven't got the results yet. But anyway, because this plant takes up so much nickel, it can be used in phytoremediation efforts, possibly. Currently, there isn't a huge store of this plant anywhere. In fact, the gathering that Dr. Engel, my wife, and I did last week was the largest amount of seed gathering of Streptanthus ever recorded. So eventually this plant could be used to pull nickel out of heavy nickel contaminated soils. It does pull other things out like magnesium and iron, but there are other plants that do that better. But because it pulls nickel out of the ground so well, the company that is funding our research is interested in using it for what is called phytomining, where you're actually mining with plants. Typically in rock mining, you're pulling ore out of the ground that is 1 to 2% nickel per amount of rock. And it requires massive explosions and chemicals being used, and it's nasty and it's energy inefficient. And phytomining, you just use the sun and you put this plant in. It won't get terribly deep because the roots don't go past like 6 inches down. But if you are constantly churning the soil, you could theoretically pull nickel out of the ground constantly, and the plant can typically retain it between 1 to 2, sometimes 3%. So if we can get it a little higher, it'll actually outcompete rock mining for nickel, and it's a win-win scenario because you take the plant, you dry it out, you put it into a bioreactor and use it for, or a biofurnace, and use it for fuel, which can then power a local area a little bit. Not that this plant would do massive amounts of power, but it helps. Every little bit helps. So theoretically, you're decontaminating soil that cannot host any other plants. You are out competing really environmentally harmful mining practices, and you are providing a little bit of power. So it's kind of a win-win-win. Now, from this point on, you won't see a lot of extra information because there's not a lot of information to give you. We are basically the forefront of knowledge right now because all the papers kind of stopped about 10 years back. The research was originally funded by the U.S. Department of Mining, which, as you can guess, because you don't recognize that name, doesn't exist anymore. And they moved on to other projects, and so the funding kind of dried up. But there has been a recent resurgence in phytomining nickel using these plants, and this one's one of the only native plants to the area. A lot of the other research was done in Europe and in China. So, but the plants I'm going to be showing you in the upcoming pictures are kind of sticks with little pods on them. So I figured I'd show you what the plant originally looks like. It starts growing out before it goes up. And so these were from February, from the plantings that we got from the seeds that Dr. Engel collected last year. And this is two of them on the far left. And then I had to do updated photos. So these were from May, and that's a yellow variety. There are yellow, purple, and what are called undulate, which are basically the flowers just kind of flop over instead of stick out. But anyway, what happens is that when they reach the point where they want to flower, they start dropping leaves. You can see in the second photo they turn brown, and then in the third photo, this one was taken just last week. It's a stick. It's a stick with pods on it, and not super impressive. But as you can see from the photo where I am covering my own face, the plant was particularly large. Like I said, these things typically stop at about 8 inches, maybe a foot if you're lucky, and this one's longer than my arm. So we made sure to collect this one and keep it in a separate bag so that we can see if this was just a fluke because there's actually soil there, or if it's a unique plant. Now, typically when you think of mountains, you think, at least around here, you think of the Appalachian Mountains because they're the closest mountains. Now, granted, I know we have students that are in the Rockies, and this might look more like home to you, but these soils, like I said, they're called serpentine soils or ultramafic outcroppings. So these are ones that have just massive amounts of bad stuff in them, lots of heavy metals, and not a lot of good things like nitrogen and phosphorus. So you'll be looking at this photo on the left. That's Dr. Engel and myself, and we are currently standing on an entire mountainside of this serpentine soil. The only thing that can really survive there are trees because the roots can go deep enough to get past the toxic stuff, and they also, pardon me, are able to handle they can get into the deeper soils because the soils aren't as contaminated deeper down. But you can see in the horizon there, the tree line and shrubbery all returns just off of this mountain. It literally is just this mountain, and you can't see it in the picture, but every so often there's just these little streptanthus plants that are just sitting there. The jewel warts are everywhere. The next photo is Dr. Engel and I showing it's just showing us collecting them. But these plants tend to like to live on mountainsides. The steeper the better. I don't know why, but I think it's just because their seed distribution system benefits more from falling down a steeper incline than these wider spread areas. They're not really a wind-blown seed, so I think gravity just disperses them better on steeper inclines. But I took that to heart when in the third photograph, you can kind of see me like right about here. This is a green dot if you go about halfway into that photo, and you'll see me on the side of a 50-foot cliff. There was a really, really good patch of streptanthus on that, and I climbed up it thinking it was granite, and it's not granite. This is very, very slick, very breakable rock, and I got up there and I realized I couldn't get down after I picked the plants. So the other blue dot just to the left of me is Dr. Engel actually guiding me down. He was on a much less steep cliffside. And so that was an interesting story, and I made it through. But that's when I found out that these plants like to live in kind of dangerous areas. Here are some other examples of what this looks like. The first one on the far left over here is a more iron-rich clay that these plants can grow in, but this is down south, typically in the kind of Yosemite area, if y'all know where that is. This is called the Red Hills. There's also one of our main stops was in a little, and when I say little town, I'm talking less than 100 people town called Chinese Camp. And typically it's not that red soil though. Typically it's more metallic color like the one in this middle photo. And you can see that the rock just shears apart and turns out these little like shards of rock. I'm not used to it at all. I'm used to, more stable ground. But they will grow in almost no soil whatsoever. And if you're not really paying attention, you'll walk right by it, as you can see in this middle photo here. But that was a yellow flower variety, and the purple flower variety, my wife is holding it here in this right-hand side photo, and it's really a pretty flower. But we're gathering it up to dry the plants out and gather the seed up for this winter, this summer, next winter, and next summer. Because the more seed we gather, the more plants we can put in the ground. We're hoping to do a field trial probably in December, January. We're going to go out there and talk to some local farmers and see if we can get a crop in some level ground where we can amend the soil nicely and see if we can get big plants in non-pot settings. But this was my view for a week. Not bad, right? Definitely worth not having signal for over a week. But when we got into Sacramento, we got signal again, and I was luckily able to start emailing and catching up with people. People were panicking because they couldn't get a hold of me for 3 to 4 days. And yeah, that was interesting. But I also wanted to show off this green rock. You can kind of see it right here on the bottom. It's called olivine. It's a type of ultramafic rock. Has a lot of metal in it. And the plant was just growing everywhere here. And this was actually a dump. Because this soil is so bad, the dump is about 50 to 100 yards that way and down the mountain. We had to climb up from here. And we found out the hard way that there were hornets that like this environment, because I don't know why, but we met some hornets. And there's a whole other mountainside you can see over right just to the left of me. And that we couldn't reach because there's ravines. This is not easy terrain to get through, but hopefully the seed that we get will be beneficial to our research. And I hope that I did a pretty decent job of explaining what we're doing. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And since we're in the last week of classes, enjoy your last week. And I hope you all have a great rest of your semester and a great rest of your time here at UF.